Hello, this is Dr. Ross, and this is the Anatomy of the Spinal Cord video lecture. It's for my class as well as Dr. Camp's Anatomy and Physiology 1. So this lecture will cover the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, as well as a little bit of spinal cord histology, sectional anatomy of the spinal cord, as well as protection of the spinal cord. All right, so let's just do a little bit of spinal cord introduction. Some of this will be a review from the previous lecture. So the spinal cord, which is shown here along the middle of this cadaver's back, is a long, thin, tubular structure, and it's made up of nervous tissue. And it's going to extend from the medulla oblongata in the brainstem to the lumbar region of the vertebral column. It encloses the central canal of the spinal cord, and that's where we're going to find cerebrospinal fluid. And along with the brain, it makes up the central nervous system. Now, the spinal cord is the main pathway for information connecting the brain to the peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord functions primarily in the transmission of nerve signals from the motor cortex in the brain to the body, and from the afferent or sensory neurons to the sensory cortex located in the brain. It's also the center for coordinating many reflexes, and it contains reflex arcs that can act independently and control reflexes. It also contains neural circuits, which are called central pattern generators. And what these do is they're responsible for controlling motor instructions for rhythmic movements such as walking. So the spinal cord gross anatomy, so it begins at the foramen magnum, which is located right here at the base of the skull. Remember, that's the large hole in the bottom of the skull, so it's going to exit through there. And then it is going to enter the spinal canal at the beginning of the cervical vertebrae. At the end of the cervical section is the first enlargement, and this enlargement is called the cervical enlargement. The second enlargement is the lumbosacral enlargement. So these enlargements are formed by an increase in the amount of gray matter that contains basically the neural machinery you need to operate the limbs. So the cervical enlargement is going to supply nerves to the shoulders and the upper limbs, and the lumbosacral enlargement is going to innervate structures of the pelvic girdle and the lower limbs. And so because of this increased amount of sort of operational tissue, you're going to see a slight enlargement in that area. Now next, the spinal cord is going to extend down, ending in a place called the conus medullaris. And so basically this is just a tapered area, and that's technically considered the end of the spinal cord. This occurs around lumbar vertebrae L1 and L2. So the reason that the spinal cord is much shorter than the vertebra that enclose it is because during development there's disproportion between spinal cord growth and vertebral column growth. So the spinal cord actually finishes growing around the age of 4, while the vertebral column finishes growing somewhere between 14 and 18. So that's why adults, the spinal cord's only going to occupy about the upper 2/3 of the vertebral column. Now, so after L1, the spinal nerves continue on. You end up with this bundle of nerve roots that continue on, and they are called the caudae equina. The cauda equina is named after its resemblance to a horse's tail, and that word is actually Latin for horsetail. Finally, the spinal column will terminate in the filum terminale, which is a delicate strand of fibrous tissue, and it's about 20 centimeters long. So now let's talk about spinal cord histology briefly. So first I'm going to review a little bit from the last lecture about nerve tissue. So nerve tissue comes in 2 types. We've got white matter, which is shown here at the top or around the spinal cord section. And the white matter consists of these myelinated axons. Recall that white matter is white largely because of the fatty substance called myelin that surrounds the nerve fibers. So what about the other tissue? The tissue in the center, shaped like a butterfly, is the gray matter. And this is going to consist of interneurons, cell bodies, and unmyelinated axons. So interneurons, cell bodies, and unmyelinated axons. So why does a myelin sheath, or what does a myelin sheath do for an axon? It's going to act as an insulator, all right, and it's also going to increase the speed of transmission of the nerve signal. So it's going to allow the messages to pass quickly from place to place. So it insulates and it increases the spread of transmission of the nerve signals. So, white matter is for quickly conducting signals over long distances, while gray matter is for making connections over short distances. So recall that when we're talking about these connections, we're talking about cell bodies receiving information from the telodendria of a neighboring neuron. All right, so now let's look a little bit more into spinal cord sectional anatomy. What you're looking at here is a diagram of a section of spinal cord. You can see the white matter surrounding the butterfly-shaped gray matter. On this slide, we're going to start by discussing the gray matter a little more in depth, and then we will continue on with the white matter on the next slide. So again, the gray matter is this butterfly-shaped area in the middle. And so at the top here, or at least the top of this diagram, we have the posterior horn. The posterior horn of the gray matter is going to receive sensory signals. And if you look over here at this gray box on the far right of your screen, it says sensory, and you can see information is traveling in toward the spinal cord, and it's going to arrive in this light blue area. Next, we have the interneurons in the gray matter, and those are there to make connections between other neurons. You have the anterior horn of the gray matter. This sends out motor signals, and you can see if you look at the similar anterior horn on the other side of the spinal cord, you can see an orange or kind of reddish area, and that is where motor information is leaving the spinal cord and traveling out to the limbs or what have you. Next is the lateral horn of the gray matter, and this is involved in the sympathetic nervous system. In the middle here is what's called the gray commissure of the gray matter, and this connects the two halves of the spinal cord. And then finally we have down here in the middle, which isn't technically gray matter, but it's in the gray matter, so I'm going to discuss it here, is the central canal. And this runs the length of the spinal cord, and it's going to contain cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. All right, so let's move on to white matter. So white matter carries information up and down and to and from the brain. Okay, so up and down the spinal cord and to and from the brain. And the white matter can be divided into three regions. You've got your posterior funiculus, which is here near the top of this diagram, the lateral funiculus to the side, and then the anterior funiculus. Now, of course, remember your terms. Posterior is going to be situated toward the front. Of course, the spinal cord's not in the front of the body, but it's going to be the part of the spinal cord closer to the front of the body and the anterior closer to the back. Then we have a shallow groove separating the posterior funiculi, and this is the posterior median sulcus. And then down here on the anterior side, you have a similar looking groove. This is called the anterior median fissure, and this is a groove where the anterior spinal artery sits. And both of these grooves kind of divide the spinal cord so that it sort of looks like a mirror image on either side. All right, now up until this point, we've been looking at a single section of spinal cord that's kind of representative. However, it's important to realize that the shape and the size of the gray matter varies, and the white matter varies according to spinal cord level. So if you look here along the right-hand side of the slide, you can see this different amounts of that butterfly-shaped gray area in these 4 different spinal sections, each of which correspond to the 4 spinal regions. You can also see that there's different amounts of white matter. So at the lower levels, there's more gray matter compared to white matter. So there's less white matter as you move down. The reason for this is mainly because the lower levels contain less ascending and descending nerve fibers. Remember, the nerve fibers are myelinated, and that's what's making up that white matter. So consider the top of the cervical region, just as we've exited the brain. Okay, so this area is going to contain nerve fibers for the upper limbs, the lower limbs. It's going to contain fibers for stimulating organs, inhibiting organs. Okay, so it's going to contain, at the very top of the spinal cord, every axon, every nerve that enters or exits the brain is going to be present in that area. But as we move down, the spinal cord, there's going to be spinal nerves exiting. Those motor nerves are going to exit. They're going to go to the limbs that they innervate. And so there are going to be fewer axons as we move down the spinal cord. Therefore, the white matter that consists largely of axons is going to be more abundant at the top. So I've kind of tried to demonstrate this here. So coming from the top, you've got nerves that go from the brain to the bottom of the spinal cord or back, all right? And those are going to go to all these different areas. So you can already see that there's fewer axons or nerves making it to the bottom, and there's more making it to the top. And then here we see there's a spinal nerve exiting. This is probably going to control an upper area, an upper limb maybe, and then maybe some to go and control the intercostal area, the intercostal muscles of the abdomen. So this is how that's going to look. As you move down, you just have fewer and fewer axons present. Now, let's move on to gray matter. So recall that gray matter in the spinal cord contains the cell bodies, among other things, for motor nerves. So you can see different amounts of gray area in sections from different spinal regions. So one of the areas So one of the areas with a large amount of gray matter or gray area would be the lumbar area. Okay, and so this is because there are many cell bodies for nerves whose axons are going to control the lower limbs. So this is where there's a large number of nerves, and so because of that, there's a large number of cell bodies. So I've got those kind of represented here as these gray, these are my sad little neurons. So here's all these cell bodies, and you have a whole bunch down here in the lumbar region. They're going to be sending out information to the lower limb to move your leg. Now, an area with much less gray matter is going to be the thoracic region just above it. That's the spinal region, the spinal section just above it. Okay, so here the horns are very thin, and that's because the nerves branching from the thoracic area are just controlling the abdominal and intercostal muscles. So there's fewer things to control, so there are less cell bodies, and there's less gray area here, gray matter, sorry. And so there's fewer bodies, and the gray matter is smaller. Okay, so now we're going to talk about spinal cord protection, which is the last section in this talk. So the spinal meninges are what I'll start with. These are 3 membranes that surround the spinal cord, and they're there to support and protect the spinal cord. The outermost meninge is the dura mater. It is hard and stiff and more durable than the other meninges. And it extends from the foramen magnum all the way to the end of the spinal cord. The next one that's just inside the dura mater is the arachnoid. This is the middle layer. It's more delicate than the dura, and it's named because of its resemblance to a spider web. And if you look up here at the top right image that's looking at a section of this, you can see these kind of light projections coming off of the arachnoid layer, and so that's where it gets its name. Finally, we have the innermost layer, and this is the pia mater. It is the meningeal envelope, and it firmly adheres to the surface of the spinal cord. And it's basically, if you were to, you can peel everything else away, but it would be very hard to remove this particular meninge. So next what I want to do is talk about the spaces that are created between these meninges. So there are 3 spaces, just like there are 3 meninges. And so they each have a name. You've got the epidural space. This is the outermost space. It's located between the spinal durameter and the periosteum of the vertebral column. So it's going to be filled, you can see there it's filled with loose connective and adipose, mostly adipose tissue. And you can kind of see those big fat cells in there. Next you have what's called the subdural space. Now this is what I would say is a potential space. It's really only going to be open by separation of the arachnoid and the dura, and this is going to typically result from trauma or some sort of pathology, like the absence of cerebrospinal fluid that would be seen in a cadaver, frankly. Finally, you have the subarachnoid space, and this is the space that exists between the arachnoid and the pia mater, and it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, which is called CSF, and this continues down the spinal cord. So cerebrospinal fluid is just a transparent, colorless fluid. It's got electrolytes, which are basically like your sodium, potassium, different ions, glucose, and pH that are all very similar to blood plasma. However, it's important to note that the presence of actual blood in the CSF would always be considered abnormal. However, the CSF itself has a consistency very similar to the blood plasma, with, of course, the exception of the cells. And that is it for this presentation. Thank you.